Arguments against L1 use in classrooms. Having discussed in detail the arguments that have been put forth in favor of L1, we will now look at the arguments put forth against the use of the first language in L2 classrooms, and we will also see how the proponents of the language awareness pedagogy tries to defend them. Now, about the use of L1 and in L2 classrooms, the researchers would argue at times that this is too complex a thing to ask the learners first to say something in English and then to articulate something in the first language. So it is like too much to ask for them, and the cognitive burden on the information processing mode of the learners is just too much. So they argue that it is best for the learners and to simplify learning to allow them to learn only in their second language without referring to their first language. They also argue that if we frequently refer to the first language while teaching L2 structures or L2 syntax or grammar or vocabulary, then we actually slow down the process of L2 learning, because we are also taking up the space where we can expose the learners to second language structures. So we are eating up that time with the use of the first language. They also argue that if we use L1 too frequently in the second language classrooms, then the learners are constantly translating, and they will continue to translate all the time when they try to communicate in second language. And this constant translation from one language to the other language is not a very efficient way of using the second language or learning the second language as well. Well, these arguments do have some weight, and we will see now how other researchers argue for the role of the first language and try to answer these allegations. Now, James, 1999, in defense of the use of the first language, says that it is not really possible in any way to stop the flow of the first language in the learner's minds. So the moment a new information or a new language is introduced, to make sense of it, they will constantly refer to their first language and try to see how similar or different it is, and try to connect what is coming to them with what they already know. If that thought process, if this stopping this thought process is not possible, then why it is better to utilize these as a resource rather than ignore it. So it does not really help the teachers when we ignore the first language, because it is already there in the minds of the learners. So the best we can do is actually utilize it. Then the researchers also argue that the use of L1 allows the learners to pay attention to the relationship between linguistic form and linguistic function. So what is the relationship, or what are the nuances of meaning differences between similar words That we can talk about by referring to the first language, and then by doing that, what we are doing is actually mediating the learning process itself. We are facilitating, mediating the learning process. And then, because the task of learning the L2 or the second language is simplified in that way, the attitude towards the first language can also be made more positive. Because now the learners, by constant references to their first language, will be able to make more sense of the second language, or whatever structures we try to teach them. And this keeps their frustration in check and develops positive attitudes towards learning of L2. It is also argued that if L1 is using specifically the pedagogy of language awareness, then it puts a protective shell around L1. So while the learners are constantly referring to their first language as they are learning their second language, they are doing it in their minds in any case. When the teachers discuss it explicitly, they clear out the wrong assumptions that might be working in the minds of the learners. So it puts the learners in a stronger position to develop the correct type of assumptions or interpretations as they think about how the two languages are linked. So when the second language is articulated, we are able to then talk about the language and allow the learners to actually articulate the thoughts that are in their mind already. Now, Atkinson even says that even translation helps in the second language learning. But the point is, the main point actually, and I cannot possibly overemphasize it, and that is that L1 use or the use of the first language in second language classrooms must be judicious. It must be to a certain extent only. And we are not talking about replacing communicative language teaching. So if we are using too much of Urdu or too much of the first language, then we are certainly depriving our learners of actually engaging in language use and being exposed to the second language. So the use of the first language has to be planned and it has to be restricted. So language awareness is a complement to communicative language teaching.